The sun was a merciless white orb in the Afghan sky, bleaching the color from everything under its gaze. Fine, talcum-like sand, stirred by the retreating Black Hawk, settled like a shroud over Sergeant Eva Reaper Cisneros and Corporal Chloe Doc Bennett. Their world had shrunk to the dimensions of a scar in the earth, a shallow foxhole that offered meager protection from the heat and the hunters. The air, thick and heavy, tasted of dust and cordite, a metallic tang that clung to the back of the throat. Ava's knuckles, wrapped around the pistol grip of her M4 carbine, were white. Her eyes, narrowed to slits, never stopped moving, scanning the barren valley below through her ACOG scope. Every rock, every shadow was a potential threat. The radio on her shoulder spat static, a useless, broken thing. They were alone. Chloe shifted beside her, the rustle of her gear unnaturally loud in the tense quiet. She wasn't looking at the valley. Her focus was inward, on her own crippled rifle. She worked the charging handle with a frantic, desperate energy, but the weapon remained silent, a dead weight. A round had struck the upper receiver during the initial chaotic ambush, jamming the mechanism beyond any field repair. "It's no good, Ava," she said, her voice a low, strained whisper that was almost swallowed by the vast, empty landscape. "It's a paperweight. A complete paperweight!" She let the weapon drop into the dust at the bottom of the hole, a gesture of utter finality. Eva didn't turn. She didn't need to. She gave a single sharp nod, her cheek still welded to the stock of her rifle. "Okay," she said, the word clipped and devoid of emotion. "We share mine." It was not a suggestion. It was a statement of fact, a new, terrifying law of their tiny, crumbling world. She finally pulled her eye from the scope, just for a second, to look at Chloe. The fear was there, a wild animal behind her friend's eyes, but it was caged by a fierce determination. Eva reached out, her movement economical, and placed the warm, familiar M4 into Chloe's waiting hands. The transfer was seamless, a silent understanding passing between them. As Chloe took up a watch position, her finger resting along the trigger guard, Eva drew her sidearm, a 9mm Beretta M9. It felt small and insignificant in her hand, a last-ditch tool for a last-ditch stand, a flicker of movement, a glint of sun on metal down by a cluster of rocks maybe 400 meters out. "Contact! Front! 400 meters!" Eva called out, her voice flat and calm, her hand already outstretched. Chloe didn't hesitate. She placed the rifle back into Eva's grasp, the exchange practiced and immediate. Eva settled back into her firing position, her breathing slowing, the world narrowing to the crosshairs and the figure now sprinting between cover. The crack of the shot was sharp and definitive, a single punishing report that echoed off the distant hills. The runner dropped. Eva worked the bolt, the spent casing spinning away, glittering in the harsh light. She ejected the near-empty magazine. "Reload!" she barked, passing the weapon back without looking. Chloe's hands were already moving, pulling a fresh magazine from her own vest. She slapped it into the mag well with a solid, satisfying thunk, racked the charging handle, and was already bringing the weapon to her shoulder, scanning for the next target. "Loaded," she confirmed, her voice steadier now, focused by the task. They moved in a deadly, synchronized rhythm, a dance of fire and motion. Sniper and loader, a perfect, desperate team bound by a single shared weapon and a dwindling supply of hope. The enemy knew they were there. They knew they were pinned. And in the oppressive silence that followed each shot, they could feel the noose tightening. The rhythm was everything. It was the only thing holding the panic at bay. Crack! A spent brass cartridge spun through the air, landing in the dust with a soft hiss. Ava's hand shot out empty. "Reload!" Chloe slapped a fresh magazine into her palm, her own hands moving with a speed born of training and terror. Ava jammed it home, chambered around, and was back on the scope in under 2 seconds. The enemy was using the terrain, darting between rocks, closing the distance. Each shot had to count. Each round was a precious commodity they could not afford to waste. During a brief, breathless lull, Chloe risked a glance at her friend. Eva's face was a mask of concentration, sweat carving clean trails through the grime on her temples. "My dad," Chloe began, her voice a raw whisper. He was a medic in Desert Storm. He told me that war is just long stretches of unbearable boredom, punctuated by moments of sheer, absolute terror. She managed a weak, shaky smile. He definitely nailed the terror part. Eva didn't smile back, but a corner of her mouth twitched. She kept her eye glued to the scope. He wasn't wrong, but he forgot to mention the damn sand. It gets everywhere. It was a soldier's gripe, a tiny piece of normalcy in an insane situation. The shared complaint was a lifeline. Then a crackle broke through the static on the radio tucked against Eva's shoulder. A voice, broken and distant, fought its way through. Any echo element. Report status. QRF is spinning up. Repeat. QRF is en route. The voice faded back into the hiss of empty air. Quick reaction force. It was the first thread of hope they had been given. They just had to survive a little longer. They just had to make their ammo last. The hope was a tangible thing, a sudden fierce fire in Chloe's chest. She looked at their remaining magazines. They were burning through them too fast. We need to slow their advance. Make them keep their heads down, Eva stated, her voice all business. She pointed with her chin towards a small, rocky outcrop about 200 meters to their left. See that shadow? I think that's where their fire is being coordinated from. Chloe followed her gaze, nodding. She understood. It wasn't just about firing back anymore. It was about controlling the battlefield, a near impossible task from a single foxhole. Eva took a deep, steadying breath, let half of it out, and squeezed the trigger. The shot was meant to intimidate, to make whoever was in that shadow reconsider their position. It worked. The volume of incoming fire decreased momentarily as the enemy sought better cover. In that precious, purchased silence, Chloe's mind raced. She thought of the men and women in her squad, hoping they had made it to safety. She thought of the letters she and Eva had joked about writing, the ones you only thought about when things got bad. She pushed the thoughts away. There was only the rifle. The next magazine. The next breath. The enemy, however, was adapting. They had realized they were facing a disciplined marksman, and their tactics shifted. The cracks of their AK-47s became more sporadic, more aimed. A round smacked into the dirt parapet just inches from Eva's head, spraying her face with grit. She didn't flinch. She simply blinked the dust from her eyes and murmured, "Okay." That was new. Her calm was unnerving, a rock for Chloe to cling to. Chloe's job was to watch their flanks, to listen for the sound of boots scrambling up the rocky slope behind them, to be the eyes for the woman who was their only teeth. The partnership was absolute. One rifle, two sets of eyes, two hearts beating a frantic, synchronized drum against the crushing weight of the desert. The lull was a trick. It was always a trick. The silence stretched, thin and taut as a tripwire, and in that silence the smallest sounds became monstrous. The scuff of a boot on rock, the faint rattle of a gear strap. They were closer now, much closer. Eva's world had shrunk to the circular view of her scope, a tiny window into a world of threats. She tracked a flicker of movement behind a gnarled, weather-beaten rock. Ahead, just for a second, she adjusted her aim, her finger taking up the slack on the trigger. The shot was a sharp, concussive crack that shattered the false calm. The head disappeared. She didn't know if it was a hit. Movement. Right flank. 60 meters. Chloe whispered, her voice tight with a new kind of urgency. The enemy was trying to flank them. They were being squeezed. Eva shifted the rifle, her movements fluid and precise despite the fear coiling in her gut. The world was reduced to angles of fire and fields of view. She saw a man sprinting from one patch of cover to another. She led him slightly, exhaled, and fired. He stumbled and fell, not getting up. The magazine ran dry. "Reload!" she snapped, her hand already outstretched. Chloe was there, the next magazine slapping into her palm with practiced efficiency. The metallic clunk of its seating home was the most beautiful sound in the world. Eva was back on the scope before the empty magazine had even hit the dirt. They were a machine, a single organism fighting for its life. The incoming fire intensified, a storm of lead and noise. Bullets snapped overhead, whining like angry insects. Others thudded into the dirt wall of their foxhole, throwing up clouds of dust and sand that coated their faces, their weapons, their water. Chloe coughed, spitting out the grit. She kept her head down, her hands busy, ready for the next exchange. Her mind, however, was racing, calculating. "Ava," she said, her voice barely audible over the din. How many left? She needed to know. They had to know. Eva fired another controlled pair, forcing a muzzle flash behind a distant rock to go silent. 2, she answered, her voice a gravelly rasp. 2 magazines after this one. 30 rounds each. 60 bullets stood between them and the end. The number hung in the air, more terrifying than any enemy advance. 60. Chloe felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She looked at the medical kit strapped to her thigh. She had bandages, she had gauze, she had tourniquets, but she had no more morphine. If one of them was hit now, the pain would be unimaginable. A ricochet screamed off a rock just to their front, a high-pitched whine that made them both flinch. A sharp, stinging piece of fragmented rock hit Ava on the cheek. She felt a warm trickle of blood, but ignored it. There was no time for pain. There was only the next target, the next breath, the next round. The enemy knew they were low on ammo. They could feel it. The attacks were becoming more brazen, less concerned with cover. They were testing the edges, probing for weakness. Eva and Chloe were the rock in the river, but the river was rising, and the rock was starting to wear away. The sun beat down, a relentless, uncaring observer. The 2 friends, bound by a single rifle and a dwindling number of chances, prepared for the final, desperate act. The fight was coming to them. There was nowhere left to run. The next enemy fighter was reckless, emboldened by their dwindling fire. He stood almost fully to spray their position. Eva didn't hesitate. The shot was clean. Center mass, he fell. The action, however, had exposed her for a fraction of a second too long. From a different position, a burst of automatic fire answered. The rounds tore into the lip of the foxhole. One round did not ricochet. It screamed off a stone embedded in the dirt and found its mark. Chloe cried out, a sharp, guttural sound of surprise and pain. Her hand clamped down on her thigh. A dark, wet stain instantly began to spread across the fabric of her fatigues. Eva's head snapped around. "Chloe!" The rifle was forgotten. The enemy was forgotten. She scrambled to her friend's side, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Let me see it. Let me see it, Doc." Chloe's face was a pale, shocked mask, her teeth gritted. Ava's hands, now slick with her friend's blood, frantically tore at the pre-cut fatigues. The wound was clean, a through and through, but it was bleeding heavily. "It's okay, it's okay, it's okay," Ava chanted, a mantra for herself as much as for Chloe. She ripped a tourniquet from her own kit, looping it high on the thigh. She cranked the windlass, the plastic rod digging into her palm until the bleeding slowed to a trickle. Chloe's breathing was ragged. "I'm okay," she gasped, the words laced with pain. "I can still load. Give me the rifle." The fight was still happening around them. Bullets continued to snap overhead. Eva looked from Chloe's determined ashen face to the advancing enemy, then back. The unspoken fear passed between them in that single, desperate glance. Their perfect system was broken. The fight had just gotten infinitely harder. Ava made a decision. She shoved the M4 into Chloe's hands. "Make them count," she ordered, her voice rough with emotion. She then drew her Beretta pistol, a weapon of last resort, and turned to face the right flank, the side Chloe could no longer watch. The world became a fractured nightmare. Eva fired the pistol with two-handed precision at a shapes moving in the rocks, the 9mm reports sounding pitifully small against the roar of the AK-47s. Behind her, she heard the louder, decisive crack of the M4. Chloe was still in the fight, propped against the dirt wall, firing one-handed. Her other hand pressed against her leg. Each shot was an agony, but each shot was a message. They were still here. They were not giving up. The enemy, sensing a critical injury, pressed their advantage. The volume of fire increased. They were like wolves closing on a wounded animal. Ava's pistol slide locked back. Empty. She was out. She dropped the useless weapon and pulled Chloe down lower into the hole as a fresh volley chewed up the ground where their heads had just been. They were down to one functioning weapon, one wounded soldier, and a handful of bullets. The dust settled around them, the taste of defeat thick in the air. They were out of time, out of options, and almost out of hope. The final act was upon them. The silence that followed the last volley was the most terrifying sound of all. It was a predatory silence, filled with the promise of the final, overwhelming rush. Ava looked at Chloe. Her friend's face was the color of chalk, her breathing shallow. The M4 lay across her lap, its barrel still warm. They had one magazine left, just one, 30 rounds. Ava's mind, stripped of all non-essential thought, focused on the simple, brutal arithmetic of survival. 30 rounds against a dozen or more advancing fighters. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Chloe's hand, trembling slightly, found the rifle. Her fingers closed around the pistol grip, the movement labored. She tried to push herself up into a better firing position, but a wave of pain washed over her, and she slumped back against the dirt with a soft groan. I can't get the angle," she whispered, her voice thick with frustration and pain. The admission cost her dearly. Eva understood. Chloe's role as the loader, her part in their deadly dance, was over. The rhythm was broken for good. "Pass it here," Eva said, her voice surprisingly calm. She took the rifle from Chloe's weak grasp. The weight of it felt different now. It was no longer just a tool. It was a last will and testament, the final word in their story. She looked at the single magazine left. It was their last breath. She slid it into the mag well, the click sounding like a tomb door closing. She chambered a round. The sound was definitive. There would be no more reloads. She risked a quick glance over the parapet. They were coming. No more darting, no more covering fire. A line of figures was advancing steadily up the slope, confident, knowing their prey was cornered. They were close enough now that Eva could see the details of their clothing, the shapes of their faces. She settled back into the foxhole, her back against the dirt, and looked at Chloe. There were no words left that could possibly matter. She reached out and squeezed Chloe's hand. Chloe squeezed back, her grip weak but her meaning clear. They would face this together. Ava turned, rising up onto her knees, bringing the rifle to her shoulder in one fluid final motion. She switched the fire selector to semi-automatic. She would make every single one of these last 30 rounds count. She aimed at the lead fighter and fired. He dropped. She shifted to the next. Fired. He fell. She was a machine, a perfect, cold instrument of war. The advancing line hesitated, shocked by the sudden, accurate resistance. They hit the dirt, but they were too close to stop now. Muzzle. Flashes blossomed from the ground as they returned fire from a prone position. A bullet tugged at the sleeve of Eva's uniform. Another kicked up dirt directly in her face, temporarily blinding her. She blinked rapidly, clearing her vision, and kept firing. She was no longer aiming for precision, just suppression. She fired again and again, the spent brass piling up around her knees. The roar of the rifle was deafening. She could feel the heat coming off the barrel. She was dimly aware of Chloe trying to shield her, to use her own body as a barrier against the incoming fire. The world had narrowed to the roar of the gun, the smell of cordite, and the advancing wall of death. The rifle's bolt locked back. Empty. The finality of the sound was absolute. It was over. Eva dropped the useless weapon and turned, throwing her body over Chloe's, a final, futile act of protection. She closed her eyes, waiting for the end. The sound began not as a sound, but as a vibration deep in the chest. A low, rhythmic thrumming that made the sand on the floor of the foxhole dance. It was a feeling more than a noise, a primal hum that cut through the ringing in Eva's ears from the final, empty click of her rifle. She dared to open her eyes, still shielding Chloe's body with her own. The enemy, who had been moments from overrunning their position, had frozen. Their heads were tilted back, their weapons momentarily forgotten, all looking up at the sky. Then the world exploded. The vibration erupted into a deafening mechanical roar as two AH-64 Apache attack helicopters crested the ridge behind them. Flying so low, Eva felt she could almost reach up and touch their skids. They were like avenging angels, their sleek, deadly forms blocking out the sun. For a moment, they hung in the air, a terrifying and beautiful sight. Then, the lead helicopter's 30mm chain gun beneath its nose began to rotate. The sound was not a series of shots, but a continuous ripping roar, like a giant sheet of canvas being torn in half. Tracers, glowing a furious red, streaked down into the enemy positions with surgical precision. The advancing line of fighters was utterly obliterated in a storm of dust, fire, and flying rock. The second Apache unleashed a volley of Hydra rockets. They shot forward with a series of sharp, punching whooshes, streaking into the valley beyond and erupting in a chain of thunderous booms that shook the very ground Ava knelt on. The remaining enemy fighters, those who had been hiding in the rocks, broke and ran. There was no fighting against this. It was not a battle. It was a judgment. The Apaches hovered, Guardians ensuring the threat was completely neutralized, their rotors beating the air into a hurricane that whipped dust and sand into a stinging frenzy. In the sudden, shocking silence that followed the cessation of the chain guns, a new sound emerged. The distinct, welcome thump of a Black Hawk helicopter's rotors. It descended into a cloud of its own, making 100 meters from their foxhole. Before it had even fully settled, soldiers in full combat gear were spilling out, securing the perimeter with professional efficiency. A medic team, marked by the red crosses on their helmets and arms, sprinted directly towards their position. Ava finally pushed herself off of Chloe, her body trembling with the aftershock of adrenaline. "They're here, Chloe. The QRF is here. You hear that? We're going home." Chloe's eyes were closed, but she managed a weak, bloody smile and a slight nod. The medics were upon them, their voices calm and authoritative. "Okay, Sergeant, we've got her. Let us in." Eva moved back, giving them space, her own hands now shaking uncontrollably. She watched as they quickly assessed Chloe, started an IV, and prepared her for movement. As they lifted Chloe onto the stretcher, her hand fluttered out, searching. Ava immediately grabbed it. "The rifle," Chloe whispered, her voice barely audible. Ava understood. She reached down and picked up the empty, dust-covered M4 carbine. It was cool to the touch now. Its work done. She placed it carefully across Chloe's lap and laid her own hand on top of it, so the weapon was cradled between them. It was a final, silent testament. The rifle that had been their shared heart, their shared burden, their only hope. It was over. The line had been held. The pact had been honored. In the roaring wind of the rescue helicopter, they had won their fight to survive. The inside of the Black Hawk was a sanctuary of organized chaos, a stark contrast to the raw, dusty hell they had just left. The thunderous beat of the rotors was a comforting, powerful sound, a promise of escape and safety. Ava sat slumped against the vibrating fuselage, her body feeling both heavy and hollow. She watched as the medics worked on Chloe, their movements quick and sure, hanging bags of plasma and calling out vitals. The bright red of the fresh bandage on Chloe's thigh was a vivid, shocking stain against the drab green of the stretcher. One of the medics offered Eva a canteen. She took it with a nod, the warm, plastic-tasting water the most wonderful thing she had ever drunk. It washed the dust and the metallic taste of fear from her mouth. Her eyes never left Chloe's face. Her friend was conscious, her gaze fixed on the ceiling of the helicopter, but she seemed distant, lost in the fog of pain and exhaustion. Then slowly Chloe's hand moved. It crept across the webbing of the stretcher until her fingers found the cold, hard metal of the M4's receiver, still lying across her legs. Her fingers tightened around it, a lifeline to the reality they had just survived. Eva reached out and covered Chloe's hand with her own. No words were spoken. None were needed. The touch said everything. "I'm here. You're safe. We made it." The flight was a blur of brown mountains and searing blue sky. Ava's mind replayed the last hours in disjointed, jarring snapshots. The crack of the ambush, the sight of Chloe's jammed rifle hitting the dirt, the feel of the warm brass landing on her arm, the sound of Chloe's cry of pain, the empty final click of the bolt, the overwhelming roar of the Apaches. It was a storm of memory too fresh and too violent to process. She focused on the steady, reassuring beep of the heart monitor they had hooked up to Chloe. That sound was her anchor. It meant Chloe was alive. The Black Hawk began its descent, the pitch of the rotors changing as it flared for landing. Through the open door, Eva saw the familiar dust-brown buildings and fortified walls of Forward Operating Base Wilson. A medical team was already waiting on the tarmac, a gurney ready. As the wheels touched down, the medics inside the cabin began the swift process of moving Chloe out. Before they lifted the stretcher, Eva gave Chloe's hand one last firm squeeze. "See you on the other side, Doc," she said, her voice rough with emotion. Chloe managed a weak smile, a real one this time, and gave a thumbs up with her free hand. Then they were moving, rushing Chloe out into the blinding sunlight and towards the field hospital. Eva remained in the helicopter for a moment longer, the sudden silence in the cabin feeling immense and empty. The crew chief gave her a pat on the shoulder. "Hell of a thing, Sergeant." "Hell of a thing?" Eva just nodded, unable to form words. She looked down at the floor of the aircraft. There, lying forgotten in the rush, was the empty M4. She bent down and picked it up, the familiar weight of comfort in her hands. It was more than a weapon now. It was a relic, a testament. Clutching it, she stepped out of the helicopter and onto the solid, blessed ground of the FOB. The fight was over, but a different kind of battle, the one in her mind, was just beginning. She took a deep, shuddering breath and began the long walk toward the debriefing tent. The rifle held tight in her grasp, a silent companion to the memories she would carry for the rest of her life. The sterile, air-conditioned air of the field hospital was a shock to the system. It smelled of antiseptic and clean linen, a world away from the dust and blood of the foxhole. Eva stood just inside the entrance, the empty M4 still held loosely in her hand, feeling like a ghost from another world. A nurse with a kind, tired face approached her. "Sergeant, your friend is in Bay 3. She's stable. The surgeon repaired the damage. She's going to be just fine." The words washed over Eva, a wave of relief so profound it made her knees feel weak. She managed a hoarse "thank you" and followed the nurse's direction. She found Chloe in a curtained-off area, propped up on a hospital bed. An IV line was taped to her arm, and her leg was heavily bandaged and elevated. She was pale, but the wild, pained look was gone from her eyes, replaced by a deep, weary peace. She was asleep. Eva pulled up a chair and sat heavily, placing the rifle gently on the floor beside her. She just watched her friend breathe, the steady rise and fall of her chest a more beautiful sight than any sunset. The constant, low-level hum of tension that had been coiled in her own body for what felt like a lifetime finally began to unspool. She must have dozed off herself, because the next thing she knew, a soft voice said, "You look terrible." Eva's eyes snapped open. Chloe was awake, watching her with a faint, teasing smile. Eva let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob. "You're one to talk," she retorted, her voice thick with sleep and emotion. She reached out and took Chloe's hand, the simple contact saying everything words could not. Later that day, after the debriefings and the statements to a stone-faced officer, Eva returned to the hospital. This time she carried something. It was the M4, but it was no longer a tool of war. She had spent an hour meticulously cleaning it, stripping away every grain of sand, every speck of powder residue, every trace of the fight. The metal gleamed under the fluorescent lights, the polymer stock wiped clean. She laid it carefully across Chloe's lap. "I thought you might want to see it," Eva said softly. "One last time." Chloe's hands, no longer trembling, rested on the cool, clean metal. She ran her fingers along the barrel, over the ejection port, across the stock where Eva's cheek had rested for all those hours. It was no longer a weapon. It was a symbol. It was the shared burden, the lifeline, the physical proof of their pact. "We did it, Eva," Chloe whispered, her eyes glistening. "We really did it," Eva nodded, a single slow movement. "We held the line." There would be no grand ceremony for this. No medal that could capture its true meaning. The real recognition was here, in this quiet room, between the two of them. It was in the shared memory of the rhythm, the shared fear, the shared will to survive. The rifle between them was a bridge connecting that past to this present, to a future they had earned the right to see. They had faced the abyss with one rifle and one purpose. And in the end, they had walked away, not just as soldiers, but as sisters forged in fire and bound by a bond that would outlast any war. The story of the foxhole was over, but the story of their friendship had just found its deepest, most unbreakable chapter.